Next, a hearing on 5G technology and cybersecurity, and global competitiveness with China. The Senate Homeland Security and Governmental Affairs Committee examined U.S. wireless security infrastructure in a hearing on Thursday.
Good morning. This hearing is called to order. I want to welcome all the witnesses. Thank you for your thoughtful written testimony, and looking forward to hearing your oral testimony and answers to our questions. I'd ask that my written opening statement be entered in the record. I just want to make a couple of comments about really kind of what I want to see the goal of this hearing to be, which is very similar to pretty much the goal of every hearing is a basic problem-solving process. And I'll start out, I haven't done this in a while, but this committee, under my chairmanship, developed a mission statement to enhance the economic and national security of America and promote more efficient, effective, and accountable government. Now, the reason I'm pointing out today is I can't really think of a hearing where that mission statement is more applicable to. When we start talking about 5G, we're talking about the economic opportunity, but we're talking about the national security risks. In order to take advantage of that opportunity, in order to avoid those national security risks, we need more efficient and effective government to step up to the plate to compete against what unfortunately is becoming not just a friendly economic rival, but an adversary and somewhat of in many cases, a malign actor on the world stage, China. And so, in terms of the definition of this problem, and again, I'm really hoping to be able to lay out a simplified definition, lay out some priorities of things that we need to address so that it can focus everybody's attention on this. So let me take a stab at the problem definition. This is an unusual one because it really starts as an opportunity. It's an opportunity of moving from 4G to 5G, which, worldwide, globally, that'll be trillions of dollars worth of economic activity. So it's an enormous opportunity, and of course, there's going to be a great deal of competition to take advantage of that opportunity. The problem really rests if we don't take advantage of it, if we're not a leader. Other people will set the standards. And again, those other people, primarily the threat would be in China, not setting the standards that really contribute to a free and open society. We have the economic aspects of this. We have set the standards. The threat that China poses in terms of just intellectual property theft. One of the reasons they can compete with us on 5G is because they've stolen hundreds of billions of dollars worth of our intellectual property. Now they're threatening to leapfrog us from that standpoint. So again, the actions, based on that basic problem definition, that opportunity that also is a problem, we have to address the spectrum allocation. In the three different types, in at least two different types of bands, and we've got great witness from the FCC that can really talk to us about that. We need to be involved and hopefully be a leader in setting the standards. We need to look at a trusted supply chain, and then where there is not proper market activity, and I hate to say this, okay, but we are competing against a non-market economy, a command economy, a very strategic competitor. We may have to take a look at market breakdowns here and do something from a standpoint of government to make sure that we support the type of supplier base that we're going to need. So again, that's kind of my relatively simple off the top of my head definition of what this problem is and some of the top priorities. I'll again, read all the testimony, really appreciate it. Let's just encourage everybody to try and simplify this as much as possible so that we leave this hearing with a pretty good understanding of what we're facing and the first steps that we have to take. Now, one final comment, because, and Diane, I think you were in that secure briefing, which was called probably about a month ago, and I know my input in that was, okay, now who's in charge of this effort? I'm heartened by the fact in testimony, we definitely have an answer. It is literally the National Economic Council residing in the White House. I spoke with Larry Kudlow last night. He has been actively engaged, and I was really glad to hear that, together with the chairman of the FCC, and with active involvement with President Trump as well. So this is a high priority. It's taken that way. I think we have the who's in charge of this effort, and certainly what we've heard in that secure briefing is we have the interagencies working very cooperatively. And so now we've got that final piece that I was wondering, okay, well, great, it's great that everybody's working cooperatively together, all the component experts, but now at least for my satisfaction, I've identified this is the agency, this is the individual that really is in charge of this and also can be held accountable for what these goals, what these actions need to be, that we need to take. So again, I'm already heartened by just going through the briefing, what I've heard, what I've read, coming into this hearing, and I'm really looking forward to the hearing itself and hopefully gain a little bit more confidence that we're not behind as I thought we were. We're actually, getting up in a pretty good position, and I think poised to hopefully leap ahead and actually win this competition. So with that, Senator Peters.
Thank you, Mr. Chairman, and thank you to all of our witnesses for being here today. Our modern economy is truly global. Internet access is no longer a luxury. It's necessary and a vital tool that connects people with educational opportunities, creates jobs, drives economic development. The introduction of 4G technology brought us live streaming, ride-sharing, on-demand delivery, and other innovations, and now 5G era is before us. This faster, stronger wireless connection will once again transform our digital world, enabling new technologies like precision agriculture, self-driving cars, and augmented reality. 5G networks and the new technologies they spur will create countless new jobs in Michigan and generate billions of dollars in economic growth all across our country. 5G has the potential to unleash new productivity and help cement the United States as a global leader in innovation, but developing the infrastructure needed to support 5G networks across the country does not come without risk. Today, China, arguably our nation's greatest global competitor, is poised to lead the world in advancing this very important technology. China's edge in the development of 5G equipment and standards poses a threat to both American economic dominance as well as our national security. The U.S. is increasingly reliant on high-speed telecommunication services to support not only our broader economy, but also our defense industry. In the race to expand 5G access, we face serious supply chain security risk by purchasing and deploying Chinese-made equipment from companies like Huawei and ZTE, companies that our intelligence community has said are beholden to the Chinese government. The devices these companies provide potentially offer cost-effective solutions to help close the digital divide. But they also pose a serious national security risk and could open a backdoor into critical American security networks. Given these serious national security risks, we must navigate a very delicate balance of ensuring that emerging 5G networks are both secure and widely available in both rural and urban areas. China's advantage in 5G may be a reality for now, but it is something we have the power to change. The United States government, including this committee, has an opportunity to play a key role in America's resurgence as a leader in the development of 5G networks. A challenge of this magnitude requires a strong, unified, and collaborative approach, capitalizing on the full power of American ingenuity. But to date, our efforts have been piecemeal and disorganized. We have not had dedicated leadership or the coordinated national strategy needed to accomplish this very critical mission. I'm encouraged by the bipartisan agreement this committee has made to support this goal. Universal 5G connectivity would encourage renewed prosperity in both urban and rural communities, unlock tremendous economic growth, and reestablish America as the leader in global innovation. I hope this hearing will serve as a driving force to help us usher in this new age and build momentum towards recapturing our place as the world's leader in communication technologies. I look forward to the testimony of our witnesses. Thank you for being here today.
Thank you, Senator Peters. It is the tradition of this committee to swear in witnesses, so if you all stand and raise your right hand. Do you swear the testimony you will give before this committee will be the truth, the whole truth, and nothing but the truth, so help you God? Please be seated. Our first witness is Mr. Chris Krebs. Mr. Krebs currently serves as the Director of the Cybersecurity and Infrastructure Security Agency. Previously, Mr. Krebs worked within DHS as a senior advisor to the Assistant Secretary for the Infrastructure Protection, where he helped establish a number of national, international risk management programs. Prior to joining DHS, Mr. Krebs was the Director of Cybersecurity Policy for Microsoft, leading their work on cybersecurity and technology issues. Mr. Krebs.
Good morning, Chairman Johnson, Ranking Member Peters, and members of the committee. Thank you for holding today's hearing and providing me an opportunity to be the first government witness to congratulate the world champion Washington Nationals. And on behalf, gotcha. Thank you. And also ask the Lerner family to lock up Steven Strasburg in a lifetime contract. I appreciate the opportunity to testify regarding the Cyber and Infrastructure Security Agency's ongoing efforts to secure the supply chain of information and communications technology, including 5G, the next generation of mobile communications networks. This is a timely hearing. No, not because it's Halloween, and this is often touted as a scary topic with boogeymen hiding behind every line of code or microchip. Ugh. But because today is the last day of National Cybersecurity Awareness Month, and because tomorrow marks the first day of Critical Infrastructure Security and Resilience Month. While my written testimony details CISA's broader approach to information and communications technology, supply chain, and risk management, I'd like to focus my opening remarks on the administration's efforts to secure 5G networks. As agencies, we've been hard at work on supply chain and 5G security for years now, taking advantage of the respective authorities, roles, and responsibilities of the various executive branch departments and agencies, a few represented here today. Over the last year, our administration-wide strategy has really come together, all under the guidance of the National Economic Council and the National Security Council. While there is no Department of 5G, no Department of Supply Chain Security, and nor should there be, I can say with confidence that the United States government is collaborating effectively across the interagency and with our industry partners. We have tight coordination mechanisms to drive the security and resilient results we all desire. Our goal is pretty straightforward. We seek to foster a competitive global ecosystem for trusted 5G vendors and promote a risk-based approach to 5G. In part, this will unlock American innovation and provide untold opportunities in the development of tomorrow's technologies. More importantly, it will deliver secure and resilient telecommunication systems and provide a sound base for 5G-enabled technologies. Our approach has 4 primary work streams, and I'll briefly touch on the work streams and allow my colleagues to expand as appropriate. First, we're addressing the policy and regulatory considerations domestically and abroad, stressing open, interoperable systems with respect for the rule of law and taking into account risks posed by the undue influence of foreign governments on suppliers. Secondly, we're examining the underpinning technology requirements, including the changes that are anticipated with software-defined networking, virtualization, and the resulting impacts on enabled services and features like autonomous vehicles, telemedicine, smart cities, and so on. Next, our work in the economic space focuses on the incentives needed to support growth of new technologies, with an emphasis on a flourishing vendor base here in the U.S., while also encouraging global financial practices, subsidies, investments, financing that are open, fair, commercially reasonable, and transparent. And finally, we seek to promote secure and resilient systems, developing a better understanding of where risk lies in our networks and managing that risk accordingly. CISA is focused here, seeking to support a risk-based approach. Our approach is consistent with our broader supply chain risk management philosophy, encompassing technical, legal, and relationship aspects of a product, company, and the regime from where the product originates. Specifically, CISA intends to address 5G security concerns through 3 primary avenues, all of which are core agency competencies: technical evaluation and analysis, stakeholder engagement, and cybersecurity best practices. We recognize that although 5G is a new and transformative technology, the essential elements to future security remain rooted in the way CISA secures all its equities. I'd also like to reinforce that this is not solely a U.S. government undertaking. Our partners in industry are critical in driving real advances in security and privacy by design and deployment, accompanied by the transparency necessary to inform appropriate risk management decisions by industry and consumers alike. Efforts like the Council to Secure the Digital Economy's consensus baseline IoT security capabilities, as well as the Charter of Trust, are both examples of industry-driven consensus efforts to help achieve that global competitive ecosystem for trusted vendors and componentry. As the Director of CISA, with a mission that analyzes risk holistically across 16 critical infrastructures and 55 national critical functions, my commitment to you all is to continue leading, coordinating, and catalyzing these activities for our mutual benefit. More work needs to be done, that's clear, but I believe we have the structures, people, and imperatives to get the job done. That's the goal. It's now up to a wide group of stakeholders, both public and private, to ensure its realization. Once again, thank you for the opportunity to appear today, and I look forward to your questions.
Thank you, Mr. Krebs. And even though the Nationals did knock the Brewers out of the playoffs, that was a really fun game to watch, and I congratulate them as well. Our next witness is Ms. Diane Ronaldo. Ms. Ronaldo is the Acting Assistant Secretary for the Communications and Information for the Department of Commerce. Prior to joining the department, Ms. Ronaldo was with the House Permanent Select Committee on Intelligence, where she was the lead committee staffer on Congress's landmark cybersecurity legislation, the Cybersecurity Act of 2015. Ms. Ronaldo also previously served as the Oversight and Budget Monitor for the National Security Agency. Ms. Ronaldo.
Chairman Johnson, Ranking Member Peters, members of the committee, thank you for the opportunity to testify today on supply chain, global competitiveness, and 5G. NTIA is responsible for advising the White House on telecommunications and information policy. In consultation with other commerce bureaus and the executive branch agencies, NTIA advocates for domestic and international policies that preserve the open internet and advance key U.S. interests at home and abroad. Our role is to foster national security, economic prosperity, and delivery of the critical public services through telecommunications. We are involved in a host of policy issues that affect the security of critical elements in our nation's telecommunications infrastructure. Winning the race to 5G is one of the most urgent areas of focus for NTIA, the department, and the administration. We are pursuing policies that enable government and industry to work together to deliver on the promises of secure 5G networks. But as Secretary of Commerce Wilbur Ross has said, we cannot be complacent. Although the United States leads the world in the application of 4G wireless technologies, other countries are trying hard to position themselves to dominate the next generation of 5G technology and services. Given the global nature of the telecommunications industry, the fight for 5G dominance will center around key issues, including the development of industry standards, as well as the ability to win in non-U.S. markets. NTIA is working closely with the State Department, Homeland Security, the Department of Defense, and the Federal Communications Commission on policies to secure the supply chain for critical information and communications technologies, enable secure network deployment, and promote innovation and free market principles. Our increased reliance on connectivity comes with increased vulnerability to cyber attacks. Securing our networks must be a major priority. We must incorporate prevention, protection, and resiliency from the start. One of the top priorities for the administration is securing the IT and communications supply chain, which is increasingly vulnerable to certain foreign-sourced products and services. At the most basic level, we must avoid clear risks. Technology that comes from suspect origins or practices should not be put into our critical systems. At NTIA, we are working to increase transparency across the digital ecosystem to help organizations make better decisions and reduce cybersecurity risks and incidents. NTIA is helping to address these challenges by supporting the Secretary of Commerce in implementing the President's executive order on securing the information and communications technology and services supply chain. NTIA has led 3 recent and successful multi-stakeholder processes on cybersecurity, looking at the challenges around disclosing software vulnerabilities and patching insecure devices. NTIA is also involved in an ongoing effort to mitigate the damaging effects of botnets. In our competitive world, the United States does not have the luxury of pursuing only some of our national priorities that depend on spectrum. We must pursue and achieve all of them. We will continue to build on the excellent model of coordination NTIA has developed with its federal and private sector partners. Again, thank you for having me, and as Chris said, go Nats.
Thank you, Ms. Ronaldo. Our next witness is Mr. Rob Strayer. Mr. Strayer is the Deputy Assistant Secretary for Cyber and International Communications and Information Policy at the State Department. In this capacity, he leads the development of international cybersecurity, internet, data, and privacy policy. Earlier in his career, Mr. Strayer served as General Counsel to the U.S. Senate Foreign Relations Committee and Deputy Chief Staff Director for U.S. Senate Committee on Homeland Security and Governmental Affairs. Mr. Strayer, welcome back.
Thank you, Mr. Chairman, Ranking Member Peters, and members of the committee. It is truly a privilege to testify before a committee where I served as a staffer a decade ago. As the world becomes more interconnected, the security of our information and communications technology, including the 5th generation of wireless technology, is becoming increasingly important for our national security and our economic prosperity, as well as the protection of privacy and individual liberties around the world. The State Department, under Secretary Pompeo's leadership, is in charge of the United States' international engagement campaign to convince our allies and partners of the importance of adopting measures to secure their 5G networks. As you both have noted, 5G networks will be transformative. They will empower a vast array of new services, including traditional critical infrastructure like the distribution of electricity. With all these services relying on 5G networks and the massive amounts of personal data that they will provide, the stakes couldn't be higher for securing these networks. As countries around the world upgrade their communication systems to 5G technology, we are urging them to adopt a risk-based security framework. I've been joined by colleagues from the full interagency in probably hundreds of bilateral and multilateral meetings over the last almost 2 years now. I personally have done many dozens of trips focused on 5G. I spent the Labor Day week, in fact, with Chairman Pai visiting 3 countries in the Gulf region, including Saudi Arabia and Bahrain, as well as going to Germany. So we have a full court press to educate our partners about the security risks and ways that they can achieve a successful future with 5G. An important element of the 5G security approach that we recommend is a careful evaluation of hardware and software equipment vendors. The evaluation criteria should include the extent to which vendors are subject to control by a foreign government, with no meaningful checks and balances on its power to compel cooperation of those vendors with intelligence and security agencies. While this should be applied to vendors in all countries, our current concern is primarily with equipment vendors from the People's Republic of China. Our assessment is that the PRC could compel Chinese equipment vendors to act against the interests of U.S. citizens and citizens of other countries around the world. If allowed to construct and service 5G networks, Chinese equipment vendors will be in a privileged position in these critical networks. They can be required by China's national intelligence law to cooperate with Chinese intelligence and security services and to keep that cooperation secret. And there is no independent judiciary or rule of law to prevent them from being required to take those actions. This will provide Chinese Communist Party the capability to disrupt critical infrastructure, intercept sensitive transmissions, and acquire sensitive technology and intellectual property, as well as the information of private citizens. Not only will China have these capabilities, but has already demonstrated its intent to misuse and exploit data. Chinese technology firms are working with authoritarian regimes, often hand in hand with the Chinese government, to suppress freedom of expression and other human rights through mass, arbitrary surveillance, censorship, and targeted restrictions on internet access. They have exported facial recognition technology that they have perfected in the Xinjiang province to more than a dozen countries. The PRC and Chinese firms also have a long history of intellectual property theft to benefit their interests. We should not allow 5G to be yet another vector for the PRC to steal intellectual property. Through our engagement, many other countries are now acknowledging the supply chain security risk and beginning to strengthen their 5G networks alongside the United States. For example, Australia, Japan, and Taiwan have taken very specific actions to protect their 5G networks from untrusted suppliers. And in May, the Czech Republic hosted more than 140 representatives of 32 countries from around the world, as well as the European Union and NATO, to build consensus on a common approach to 5G security. This effort produced what's known as the Prague Proposals, a set of recommendations on how to build securely and resiliently 5G networks based on free and fair competition, transparency, and the rule of law. We've been working to advance the principles in the Prague Proposals by encouraging other countries to endorse them. We have also signed a number of memorandums of understanding for research and development and the application of 5G technology with like-minded countries, including Romania and Poland, and we'll soon sign one with Estonia. We're also working with many other countries in the same regard. In October, on October 9th to be exact, the European Commission and EU member states released their own coordinated risk assessment on 5G. We were very encouraged that the risk assessment clearly identified the risk that 5G network suppliers of them being subject to pressure and control by a third country, especially in countries without, quote, legislative or democratic checks and balances in place, end quote. The EU risk assessment itself is a sign of progress in our 5G campaign, and it demonstrates that our allies and partners are recognizing the risk of untrusted vendors, but our work is far from over. Next, the European Commission and member states will use that assessment to develop and agree upon a toolbox of security measures by the end of the year. It is vital that this toolbox address the vulnerabilities and risks that are already identified in their assessment including from untrusted suppliers, and that member states then implement those security measures in their own binding national measures to safeguard their networks, just as we are doing in the United States. Thank you for the opportunity to appear today.
Thank you, Mr. Strayer. Our final witness is Ms. Jessica Rosenworcel. Ms. Rosenworcel currently serves as a commissioner for the Federal Communications Commission. In this role, she works to foster economic growth and security, promote accessibility, and develop policies to help expand the reach of broadband to schools, libraries, hospitals, and households across the country. Prior to joining the FCC, she served as Senior Communications Counsel for the U.S. Senate Committee on Commerce, Science, and Transportation. Ms. Rosenworcel.
Good morning. Chairman Johnson, Ranking Member Peters, and members of the committee. For the last decade, the United States has led the world in wireless technology and performance, and we have reaped the benefits. The smartphone revolution began here on our shores, and it helped secure our global dominance in the technology sector. So now let me be blunt. That authority is being challenged. Extending this leadership into the next generation of wireless technologies known as 5G is going to be difficult. Of course, it's worth the effort because these networks are going to kickstart the next big digital transformation. However, earlier this year, the Defense Innovation Board, which is our military's premier advisory board of academic researchers and private sector technologists, surveyed the state of 5G networks and issued a sober warning. They found that the country that owns 5G will own innovations and set the standards for the rest of the world. And that country is currently not likely to be the United States. This is a clarion call. Other nations saw very clearly the success the United States had in the last generation of wireless technology, and they are working overtime to ensure they secure a leadership position in 5G. We see it in deployment. Switzerland, South Korea, China, Germany, and Japan are making great strides with their 5G efforts. We see it in activity in standards bodies like 3GPP and the ITU, where 5G specifications are being hammered out right now. And we see it in patents and equipment. Chinese companies own 36% of all 5G standard essential patents. Here in the U.S., our companies hold just 14%. In fact, there are no longer any United States-based manufacturers of key 5G network equipment. The truth is, we are facing well-resourced challenges to our 5G leadership from every direction. And so far, we do not have a comprehensive national plan to meet this challenge. We need one. And here are 4 ideas it should include. First, if we want to lead in 5G, we have to secure the 5G supply chain. To this end, at the FCC, we have a rulemaking to ensure that our Universal Service Fund, which provides billions annually to help support broadband in rural America, will not be used to purchase insecure network equipment. This rulemaking has inexplicably stalled at the agency for the last year and a half, but now, perhaps since you announced this hearing, we have publicized we will vote on this in 3 short weeks. Second, we need an approach to supply chain security that recognizes that despite our best efforts, secure networks in the United States will only get us so far. We need to start researching how we can build networks that can withstand connection to equipment vulnerabilities around the world. One way to do this is to invest in virtualizing radio access networks, what's known as Open RAN. If we can unlock the RAN and diversify the equipment in this part of our networks, we can increase security and push the market for equipment to where the United States is strongest, in software and semiconductors. Third, we need smarter spectrum policy. To date, the FCC has aggressively focused its early efforts to support 5G wireless service by bringing only high-band spectrum to market. This is a mistake. The rest of the world does not have this singular focus on high-band spectrum, and with good reason. These airwaves have substantial capacity, but the signals do not travel far. That means commercializing them in all but our most urban locations is impossible. This is not good for rural America, and it could mean with 5G we deepen the digital divide. So the FCC needs to change course and make it a priority to auction mid-band spectrum, which is better suited to extend the promise of 5G service to everyone, everywhere. Fourth and finally, with 5G, we are moving to a world with billions of connected devices around us in the Internet of Things. We need to adjust our policies now to plan for this future. Here is what that could look like. Every device that emits radio frequency at some point passes through the FCC. And if you want proof, just pull out your smartphone or look at the back of your computer or television. You'll see an identification number from the FCC. It's a stamp of approval. It means the device complies with FCC interference rules and policy objectives before it is marketed or imported in the United States. The FCC needs to revisit this process and use it to explore how we can encourage device manufacturers to build security into all new products. And to do this, we could build on the National Institute of Standards and Technology's draft set of security recommendations for devices in the Internet of Things. But the most important thing we need to do is get started right now. Chairman Johnson, Ranking Member Peters, and members of the committee, thank you for having me here today. I look forward to answering any questions you might have.
Thank you, Ms. Rosenworcel. I really appreciate the attendance of my colleagues here, and so out of respect for their time, I'll delay my questioning and turn it over to Senator Peters.
Thank you, Mr. Chairman. On Monday, Chairman Pai of the FCC presented a plan to address the supply chain risk in our networks. This includes a proposal known as RIP and Replace that would require carriers receiving support from the Universal Service Fund to remove existing equipment and services deemed to be of national security risk from their networks and provide financial assistance to those companies that do that. To Commissioner Rosenworcel, is there a comprehensive database or map where Huawei or ZTE equipment has been deployed in the United States?
Thank you, Senator Peters, for the question. No, there is not right now. It is my hope that with this proceeding, we can develop one. We know we need to. Much of this equipment lies next to military bases in this country. It's insecure, and we need to move it out.
So who should be developing that? What process would that look like?
I think we have to start with our notice of proposed rulemaking and seek comment on where this equipment lies, how much of it is out there, and at what point in its useful network life cycle it's at, because we have to understand where it is before we decide what dollars we make available to help rip and replace it.
Mr. Krebs, and then I'd like the rest of the panel to comment. If we do pursue this rip and replace approach, should it apply to all equipment without exception?
Can you clarify, do you mean just within rural deployments, or do you mean Huawei and
ZTE?
Globally, ICT across the United States in every environment? I would hesitate to go that far. I think we need to look and understand where the risk truly is and focus our efforts there, particularly if we're talking federal resources getting into play here. But again, focus on where the risk lies and focus our efforts there.
You can just go down the panel if we could, please.
Yes, I would just echo that. NTIA works closely with DHS and their risk assessment task force. So these are the types of the conversations that we're having. Understanding that there's only a certain amount of money, we want to make sure that we're being smart with that deployment.
I think it's important to recognize that we're talking about existing 4G networks that have this unsecure equipment. When we move to 5G, the risk profile changes dramatically, really increasing the cyber attack surface area. So more parts will become critical as there's the smart computing moving out to the edge more. So I think a vast new array of technology that's not considered critical will become so in the 5G network.
Okay.
I largely agree with my colleagues, but I would say the primary focus right now should be the $4.5 billion a year that the Universal Service Fund contributes to rural carriers across this country to deploy broadband.
Well, that actually leads to the question, how should the cost and impacts of rolling this out in rural communities be factored into the risk-based decisions that I think I've heard everyone say? How would you do that?
I think we have to start with this rulemaking and make some assessments about it and work with this committee to identify what our priorities should be. But I think that we can all agree that the goal is to take this equipment out of our networks and to make sure it is no longer there as we head to 5G.
To anybody else on rural? Yes, Mr. Krebs.
I think this is the right course of the conversation. I think what we also need to focus on, what are the economic realities of a flash cut, of pulling this equipment out today from 4G? What, as you mentioned, is what Commissioner Rosenworcel mentioned, what is the life cycle? You know, how are they going to age this stuff out if it's going to happen over the next 12, 18, 24 months, and we can contain or manage the risk? Maybe we let it go naturally through the process. Just yesterday in Denver, Colorado, the U.S. Chamber of Commerce hosted an event, a rural engagement initiative that brought regional rural providers together with representatives from everyone that you see up here. In fact, some of the folks in the room were there. One of the outcomes that came out of that engagement was on the provider side, the telecommunications provider side, to help develop what a playbook looks like for flash cut and what the associated costs might be. So again, I think we're on the right track. I think an RFP or an RFI process is likely a good way to elicit information as well.
Well, I think a really important point is that we're going to have a gap if there's a ban on Huawei and ZTE. How would the administration deal with the cost associated with that? Any idea?
I think that's the right conversation to have between the administration and Congress on what the appropriate cost sharing or the cost burden between federal government and the private sector and in some cases state and local authorities of, who is ultimately responsible. Again, we're not talking about pulling all this stuff out tomorrow. There is a reasonable plan likely that would allow for transitioning out over the next 1.5 to 2 years.
Commissioner?
I agree with that. The estimated costs of removal right now are between $700 million to $1 billion. But the one good fact we have is we have a template for this. Congress in 2012 asked the FCC to help with the relocation of broadcasters in the 600 megahertz band and set aside funds for us to do just that. We should borrow the template we used for that repurposing of equipment. It involved audits, site visits, certification of where equipment is and is not, because I think it's worked well, and I think it could serve us well in this environment too.
If the FCC proposal is approved, American companies and citizens will still have to transmit and connect with networks abroad, as I think you mentioned, Commissioner, in your opening comments that use Huawei and ZTE equipment. My question is for you, Mr. Strayer. Does the FCC's most recent action protect U.S. equipment and networks from vulnerabilities abroad, or do you share some of the concerns that we've heard from the Commissioner?
I think the primary concern abroad will be that as we're increasingly interconnected, if there's ability to disrupt critical services abroad, that'll quickly have an impact in the United States. So they will have a follow-on impact, so most immediately in the United States, from having unsecure networks if they're compromised by having untrusted vendors.
Commissioner, if you expand on your comments that you made in your opening.
Yeah, listen, I think my colleague here, Rob, has done incredible work going around the world and pressing our diplomatic case for removing this equipment from other nations' networks and not investing in it for 5G. But the truth is we're going to need other plans on the table, too. That's why I mentioned virtualization of the radio access network. We're going to have to start thinking about technologies that allow us to be secure in a world where we have to connect to insecure networks.
Great. Thank you.
Thanks, Senator Peters. Real quick comment on the rip and replace, and Ms. Rosenroso, you're quoting figures that I also heard from some of the vendors. I would just suggest as we're trying to undertake that study, talk to those alternate vendors because they probably bid on this and they probably know exactly where that equipment exists, not only here but also in Europe, which would be a little bit more expensive. But again, when the $700 to $1 billion, when you're talking about a significant national security threat, that sounds like a probably pretty manageable cost that we ought to seriously consider. But again, I would really suggest the government agencies go to those alternate vendors who probably quoted on this. Next, Senator Hassan.
Well, thank you, Mr. Chair, and thank you to you and Ranking Member Peters for holding this hearing. Thank you to our witnesses for taking the time to help educate us all on this topic. And as a Red Sox fan, I will give a begrudging congratulations to the Nats, but acknowledge that we waited 86 years, the Nats waited 95, so we feel your joy this morning. I wanted to start with Ambassador Strayer because on this topic of our diplomatic efforts, I recently traveled to India and met with India's cyber coordinator. During this meeting, we learned that while India is very concerned about privacy and about some of the warnings that we have been trying to impart about Huawei, the country is seriously considering using Huawei's infrastructure for India's 5G rollout. They talked about, well, we're just doing a pilot. They could come and do the pilot. I said, how long would the pilot last? They said a year. That's a long time. Moreover, many of our European allies who are ordinarily concerned with transparency and data privacy are still considering incorporating Huawei devices into their 5G infrastructure, even though alternatives are available from EU-based companies. So, Ambassador, can you tell us what else we should be doing? It's kind of a follow-up to the Commissioner's points. What else should we be doing to convince allies, partners, and other nations to move away from Huawei and ZTE infrastructure? What resources do you need to succeed in this mission?
Thanks for that very insightful question. I'm glad you were able to raise that with the Indians. We were doing the similar dialogue with them just a few weeks ago. Right. There's no doubt that the cheap price point for some of the Huawei and ZTE equipment has allowed them to get into the if you will, the legacy networks as they move to 5G. Many of the telecom operators argue that it's going to be cost prohibitive for them to use a more secure vendor. There's analysis that shows that myth busting a lot of these arguments that the telecom operators are throwing out there. First of all, they're not going to fall behind technologically if they go with one of the EU vendors or Samsung. Yeah. In fact, Reliance Jio, one of the largest telecom operators in India, is using almost exclusively Samsung at this point. And of course, we in the United States are using those carriers, so those providers. There's no way you fall behind technologically. There's also no real concern, shouldn't be a huge concern about cost. Any technology in the networks that's pre-2016 has to be replaced anyway. So you're only looking at the last couple years of deployment, and there's ways to make that be replaced on a normal life cycle. So, there's other concerns that these countries have that include kind of coercive measures that the Chinese can use against them if they were to not allow their national champions to participate.
So, given that, let's just follow up for a minute. I understand all those arguments. They're some of the same arguments I've been making to countries like India, along with you, but it doesn't seem that our partners are listening. So what else should we be doing, or what additional resources do you need?
So on that front, I think we're getting the understanding, almost every country now says they will prohibit the untrusted vendors from the core of their network. So that begs the question, why allow them in the edge? And what is the value of the data that's at the edge that they're going to be willing to give up? As far as additional resources, we're already thinking about how we've initiated programs to help improve connectivity and that is trusted connectivity in developing countries. So we already have some of that moving in the right direction as far as resources to help develop trusted networks. It would be helpful as you as senators or delegations to these countries around the world that you talk to their parliaments. This isn't just a technical discussion. Some would want this to be resident in some kind of technical telecom discussion. This is really about our fundamental values and about geopolitical threats, because it's inherently impossible to test your way into security when it comes to telecom technology. And that's because you can always insert a backdoor in the tens of millions of lines of code. So if you as members are willing to go out there and talk to parliamentary colleagues around the world, I think that would help us a tremendous amount to make sure that they're invested in the political process. This, in the end of the day, has to be a political process, not just a bureaucratic process.
Okay, and then to follow up on that point to all of the witnesses, and very quickly if you can, 5G is still taking shape. Technical standards that guide how 5G will ultimately work are being actively developed in international standard setting forums, and you've all referenced that. It is vital that the United States drives this conversation and that China isn't allowed to dominate the future of 5G to the detriment of the United States and our allies. So from each of you, how are your organizations coordinating engagements in the international standards bodies in order to counteract China's influence? Because China's being really aggressive in this. I'll start with Mr. Krebs.
So we directly coordinate both through the NSC process and also as an operational agency to agency to ensure that when we deploy to the 3GPP or other standards bodies, that we have consistent direction, priorities, working with our industry partners.
Okay. Ms. Rinaldo, anything to add?
Yes, NTIA actually participates at 3GPP on public safety issues, as well as FirstNet, which resides under us. So we are there on the floor talking to people.
The international conference is that worldwide spectrum policy is taking place right now in Sharm el-Sheikh, Egypt. We've got a delegation of 120 people from the private sector and from government there. Chairman Pai is there. We have an ambassador from the State Department there leading that. So we're leading these international bodies. I think that this word about standard essential patents, you can carve that a lot of ways. Certainly the Chinese propaganda has been to assert that they're leading. But there's a report out today that says Intel and Qualcomm have the most valuable of what are likely to be standard essential patents. So it's a competitive space, and we need to be vigilant. But I think we're in a very good place for the future.
Go ahead.
I agree with you that we need to assess if all this interagency coordination is really working. And the best way to do it is after the World Radio Conference, which is taking place right now in Egypt, to come back and assess what our experience has been with the 193 nations and how successful we've been at moving our spectrum policies forward.
Okay, thank you. I have a couple other questions. Mr. Krebs, briefly, I want to invite you to come to New Hampshire and work with some of my local and County folks on the issue of ransomware, because I think we need to have increasingly better partnerships on that. So can you commit to,
Absolutely.
to helping us
This
with
is a
that?
huge area of focus for us right now, not just on normal state and locals, but also as we think about elections and voter registration databases. Big initiative area for us right now.
Okay, and thank you. And I am running out of time, but I'm going to ask if I come back and we're still having the hearing, I want to follow up with Commissioner Rosenworcel on the issue of the FCC auction of mid-band spectrum and how important that's going to be in terms of the rural-urban digital divide. So I hope to follow up with you on that. Thanks.
Quick answer, it's important. Senator Romney.
Thank you, Mr. Chairman, and thank you to each of you who are working in this very vital area. In a lot of respects, it's sad that we're having to hold this hearing. It is extraordinary that China has been able to take such a substantial lead in an area that's not only important for us economically, but vital to national security. And my prediction is that we'll be repeating this picture again and again in various other areas that are important economically and with regards to our national security. This is the first example of what's going to happen again and again. And I guess I'd like to address my question to all of you, or whoever would like to respond to it, as to how it is that, if you will, free market economies were unsuccessful in establishing our own lead with regards to 5G. How is it that Chinese companies were able to get so far ahead of us on the track that we're trying to chase them and catch up to them? I would note that China has a very clear strategy as to where they want to be in 5G, but it also economically, geopolitically, militarily. And we as a nation don't have a strategy. We respond on an ad hoc basis. When we see them ahead on the track, we say, oh, we've got to do something about that. But you know, always chasing your competitor is not a successful strategy. And not only do we not have a strategy to deal economically with a player that does not play by the rules, we don't even have a process underway or much focus underway nationally to describe how we are going to compete with a nation that continues to break the rules, how we and the West will do so. I only think this could be done on a collaborative basis with ourselves and other free nations. And so we'd keep Ambassador Strayer from having to run around country by country begging people, oh, please don't do what's in your best economic interest. Hold on, because we've got something better coming along. This just doesn't make sense as a strategy for our nation. So I'll go back to my question and say, how is it we got so far behind on 5G with such extraordinary companies, in many cases not in the U.S., but companies in South Korea, companies in the EU that participate in this area? How did China get such a big lead? Why did we let them get so far ahead?
If I may start, Senator, you know, I would say at the front end that we do have roughly a general strategic guidance from our national cyber strategy, and we are taking on China across a range of areas, especially holding them accountable for their inability or their reluctance to implement the rules-based international order that they agreed to when we let them accede to the WTO. And I think it's also important in 5G to recognize that Cisco, Intel, Qualcomm are world leaders in the technology. What we don't produce is the hardware that forms this radio access network. And we're quickly moving that direction, thinking about how we can virtualize more functions and moving to the area where we'll be really strong, which is in software with more generic hardware. So I think that's how we have a general mission. We are talking to our partners and allies about trusted technologies, emerging technology of the future to set the right rules of the road. But fundamentally, these Chinese companies are not competing in any type of capitalist system of free and fair markets. They're being subsidized substantially. So we need to think about targeted R&D and efforts to work with our allies to see how we can each play to our best of our strengths.
Yeah, thank you.
I think, as Ambassador Strayer mentioned, I think we're kind of in a blip. The piece that the Chinese own the most is the radio access network. I think, given some of the comments, in particular, Commissioner Rosenworcel mentioned about focusing on virtualization and open radio access networks, I think if we were to hold this hearing in a year to 18 months to 24 months, completely different conversation about the options, trusted options available in the marketplace. So what we've got to do is make sure that we sync up the timelines, particularly on an international basis. I encourage everyone, if you haven't already, go look at the Huawei oversight Board report that the UK issued earlier this year. It's a pretty damning document in terms of an evaluation of the security quality of Huawei products. And this is from a country that's been assessing technically, from a cybersecurity perspective, the quality of Huawei products now for 10 years. First, they say not much improvement over that 10-year period. Moreover, the transformation plan that Huawei has issued indicates that, by their own admission, Huawei's own public estimates are that this transformation to bring Huawei's equipment to a commercially reasonable cybersecurity posture will take 3 to 5 years. This is sufficient evidence for us as Rob goes around the world and talks about don't make a bad decision now, you'll be paying for it for the next 10 years. This is the sort of evidence we need to say, hold on, let's work and let's incentivize this alternative trusted vendor base to emerge, to flourish. And I think this is the opportunity in front of us. We've got to put a lot more effort in, whether it's DoD and their RFP that they've recently issued or they will be issuing on experimentation to encourage these companies to come forward. There's great opportunity in front of us. Again, my hope is that a year from now, a little bit more than that, different conversation.
Yeah, please.
And just to echo those comments, at the Department of Commerce, we really look to answer that question, if not them, then who? And we do see the American companies, the software vendors that are going to fill that void with software-defined networks. You also often hear that the Chinese send swarms of people to the standards body and they vote in block, whereas we go, work with our partners, work with industry, but that's where you're going to get the best products. So I think as we discuss what is the answer to our success, how do we win the race to 5G? It's not being more like them, it's doubling down on us. So that's what we're focusing on and collaborating together on.
Thank you.
Well, Senator, I think you're right. And I think the evidence is around for all of us to see. In today's Wall Street Journal, it mentions how China will have 130,000 cell sites equipped for 5G by the end of the year. South Korea will have 75,000, and the United States will have 10,000. The truth is we've rested on our 4G laurels, and that's not a good place to sit. And if I had to choose one thing that we should change right now, we need a spectrum strategy that makes sure 5G service gets to everyone all across the country. We have doubled down in the United States on auctioning high-band spectrum, which propagates between one corner of this room and the other. We will never make that an economic way to deploy 5G everywhere, and it will reduce our power and our scale for equipment, devices, and innovation.
Thank you.
Just real quick, as long as we're on the topic, I do want to throw out the question, does it make sense for the FTC to be suing Qualcomm under antitrust? Does that lawsuit continue to make sense? Ms. Rosenworcel.
That is outside of my jurisdiction, but I will acknowledge that, yeah, I know, it's just one letter, right? I will acknowledge that the United States has really powerful operators when it comes to software and semiconductors, and we should figure out how to use that as we forge our way into the future.
Anybody else want to comment on that? It's got me scratching my head. Senator Langford.
Mr. Chairman, thank you. Thank you all for the work that you're doing on this. It's exceptionally important. I have a lot of folks that will catch me about the access to data that Facebook or Google or different internet providers will have or Microsoft will have, and they'll say they have access to a lot of data, and I will typically smile at them and say no one has more access to your data than your cell phone does, because they have all of those plus a whole lot more. And it is remarkable to me how little focus there has been on the security around everything that goes through your cell phone. And for folks in rural Oklahoma, they would tell you that many of their irrigation systems are connected to their cell phones. Control systems for valves are connected to cell phones. So whether it's energy, agriculture, manufacturing, it all goes through this cell network. And so thank you for your focus on the 5G, on the security, because we cannot get this wrong, because every bit of our data and every bit of our manufacturing and our systems and our inventions all go through this system. So I appreciate you doing this. Let me come back to the spectrum conversation. Why isn't there a conversation on the mid-band right now?
Well, there is a conversation, Senator, on mid-band spectrum right now. My primary concern is that the FCC during this administration has chosen to put all of its early efforts on high band. We have auctioned the 24 gigahertz band, the 28 gigahertz band. By the end of this year, we will have the 37 gigahertz band, the 39 gigahertz band, and the 47 gigahertz band.
So why not the mid-range?
You and I have the same question. I think we should have prioritized the 3.5 gigahertz band and done it 2 years ago, because those are the airwaves that are going to help us reach rural America and urban America. We're making a mistake, and the rest of the world is not auctioning high-band spectrum. There are 16 nations right now that have already brought mid-band spectrum to market. That's where the bulk of the economy is going for wireless, for 5G, and the United States is behind.
So let me switch topics on that, because that's helpful. We'll follow up on it. Let me switch topics on the hardware side of the manufacturing in this system. You've all mentioned that one of the issues we have is not necessarily the software. We have a lot of software that's currently very innovative. It's the hardware manufacturing side of that. What is missing in the hardware side of it is that we've just outsourced the hardware for so long to China and to other places that we just don't have the locations. Is it a raw material issue? It's certainly not a creativity nor capital issue. We have that in the United States. So what is the gap on the manufacturing side?
On the manufacturing side, I believe I've heard that 40% of the makeup of the network is actually American manufacturing companies. It's the RAN, the radio access networks, that the United States does not have a hardware manufacturer.
Correct. That's the part I'm talking about.
Right. So I think when we talk about the software-defined networks and how are we going to innovate around that problem, that is where we're going to inject the innovation to create the networks of the future. So that's what we are focusing on now. And we believe there's beta testing as we speak, and that it could be a reality in as early as 18 months.
So you're saying the radio access is not as needed if we can have a software workaround?
Correct.
Senator, I just point out that the reason that the old Bell Labs became Lucent, that got bought by Alcatel, a French company that got bought out by Nokia. So there's still research going on in America in this area. It's just that it's owned at the headquarters level in Europe. And there's going to be new manufacturing by Ericsson in Florida. There's Samsung fabrication of chips going on in Austin, Texas. They put $17 billion into it. So there's going to be manufacturing. The long-term solution, I think, is along the lines of the acting administrator's point. But we do see manufacturing here. And there's obviously competition coming from China that's massively subsidized. Right. So that's really where the market is failing, is in the subsidization.
Mr. Krebs, this is something you track all the time on the supply chain issues. As you know extremely well, we have one bad link with data. That is the spot to get a chance to infiltrate unlimited amounts of data. When you start looking at supply chain issues, where do you see the gap? Where do you see the engagement? What is it that the United States Congress and the United States government needs to be involved in? Or what do we need to do less of to allow that market to be able to grow?
So I think supply chain is an emerging area of focus for certainly my agency, but the rest of the administration. It's much like cybersecurity. It's about identifying where the risk lies, managing that risk appropriately, and putting your attention where the gaps are. So this time last year, or a little bit earlier, we established an Information Communications Technology Supply Chain Risk Management Task Force. Again, all the agencies here are represented on that task force, 20 federal agencies, 20 tech companies, and 20 comms companies. 4 different work streams. One, first and foremost, is what's information sharing look like on supply chain risks? Second, what is a threat profile or the categories of threats we need to be concerned about? Third is how do we develop trusted qualified bidders lists? And lastly, how do we incentivizing purchasing from original equipment manufacturers and trusted resellers to eliminate the counterfeit problem? This is an incredibly important area of work because it gives everyone, whether you're super sophisticated, highly leveraged and invested in supply chain issues, or down to just your average somewhere subcontractor in a supply chain conversation, gives them a common operating language or common framework by which to assess. One of the big things that I think came out of this conversation is when we talk about information sharing, when we talk about sharing threats of companies that may be of concern, there are examples. The National Regulatory Framework 10 CFR Part 21 has a reporting of defects and non-compliance. If you come across something in supply chain, you have to report it. There's no similar standard for other high risk areas of infrastructure.
Is that a gap in law? Is that a gap in regulatory?
I think it's at this point it's probably both, but I'd focus on how do you have a company that comes across an issue with an untrusted vendor. They have a significant civil litigation risk for publicly outing that company? How do we give them the appropriate information sharing protections that they can make a report into whether it's a government or other industry partners, get away from antitrust issue, anti-competitive issues? This is an area that we think needs more attention.
Let me bring up two quick things on this. One is, as we're going through supply chain conversation, we need to deal with the raw materials and rare earth minerals. That has been a weak area for us as a nation. We have been complacent to allow rare earth minerals to come from China and to say, well, they're going to manufacture, they're going to mine, and they're going to handle all that, but we have environmental issues, and so we're not going to do rare earth minerals. We can do it cleaner and better than anywhere else in the world, and we should lean in on that one. That's an area where we need to identify. And Ms. Rosenworcel, one of the areas that is not related to this, but every time I see anyone from the FCC, I bring up one issue with them, and that is prison cell phone jamming. We're not going to talk about it, but I just want to be able to bring it up and to say it is allowed in federal prisons. It's not allowed in state prisons, and that is an area of gap in law that we need to address, but we need FCC's engagement on working through standards for when that jamming device is actually done and tested. They want to test against a group of standards. FCC is the one who has to establish that. We have major problems with contraband cell phones across the entire country in prisons, and we need the FCC to engage in this area. And I know it's a surprise question to you. I'm not going to ask you to respond to it, but I'm not going to also miss the opportunity to say we need that. Thank you.
Senator Carper.
I remember Senator Langford being down in Guatemala, maybe with Senator Johnson. We're meeting with the president of, to your last point, the president of Guatemala. And I said to him, you know, we'd been visiting some of their prisons. And I said, you know, you have, there's technology that you have, Mr. President, your prison guards are allowing cell phones to be used by criminals in the prisons and conduct their criminal business. And he said, really? I said, yeah. And I said, you know, there's technology that can jam those. And he said, really? I said, yeah. And I said, and you know you have it in your prisons? And he said, really? I said, yeah. And I said, and you don't use it? And he said, really? I said, yeah. I said, you know who's responsible for making sure that this stuff is there and is used is your Interior Minister. He's sitting right here. And he's not making sure that's being done. And he said, really? And I said, yes. 6 months later, they were both in prison. And I hope they're using their cell phones badly. But thank you. It's an important point, and not just for the U.S. Ms. Rosenworcel, I love your name. Have you always been a Rosenworcel?
Have.
Okay, good. I'd stick with that one. You ran through 4 ideas to help secure U.S. leadership on 5G. Just say those again quickly, and I'm going to ask your colleagues to respond to them and just say whether they think you're making sense or not.
First, secure the supply chain. Second, we need to think beyond supply chain and look to virtualization of radio access networks. Third, we have to be smarter about the spectrum that we auction and auction more mid-band spectrum. And fourth, we have to come up with policies to secure the billions of devices in the Internet of Things.
Mr. Strayer, nice to see you.
Great to see you, Senator.
In fact, do I call you Mr. Secretary now? Is that what?
No, well, I mean, I guess everyone wants titles in this town, but I'll stick with being in a town with the Washington Nats as the national champion, the world champion.
There you go. Isn't that great?
If I could respond just briefly.
My favorite baseball team is the Detroit Tigers. We had the worst record in baseball, but 3 of the best former pitchers, 4 actually, Purcell, Red Sox. You got Gary and I, both Tigers fans. We traded off Verlander. We traded off Max Scherzer, and we traded off Sanchez. And someday we'll be good again.
Thank you for those 2 pitchers.
The farm team, yeah.
There you go. We have really good arms in AA and AAA.
Right. If I may, completely agree that we need to work on the supply chain. I think that, I don't know if we mentioned it yet today, but you know, President Trump signed an executive order on May 15th of this year to supply, declared a national emergency to supply to protect our domestic communications technology, and that will soon be followed by binding regulations later this year. I think 100% agree with the idea that virtualization of the functions of the radio access network are going to be very important to allow the breakup of the proprietary lock-in that many of the current radio access network providers have today. And that will also reduce costs on capital expenditure as well as operational costs for providers. So it can be very competitive with regard to some of the current providers, such as those in China, if we move toward more virtualization. On the mid-band point, I think it's worth noting, first of all, that getting to rural areas under the T-Mobile Sprint merger, in the next 3 years, they're required to cover 97% of the U.S. population, and in 6 years, to cover 99% of the U.S. population. Now, the FCC, understand, is going to proceed with proceeding on the 3.5 gigahertz mid-band spectrum next summer. They had to prioritize some of the millimeter wave, but I think we shouldn't denigrate the importance of millimeter wave. That's going to be so important to manufacturing and other use cases that are going to require the most maximal amount of throughput, which is only available through millimeter wave. That's the kind of beauty of that technology, is that it doesn't go as far, but it has the greatest amount of data transmission available. And of course, Chairman Pai has said by at the end of this fall, we're going to have a plan to move forward on the C-band, which is also mid-band, and I understand 2.5 gigahertz will follow probably in the next year after that. So we certainly need to keep moving forward with this, but we have, I think, sufficient plans to ensure that we have mid-band available in the blend of low-band, mid-band, and high-band spectrum that we need.
Thank you. Ms. Rinaldi, I'm going to ask you to answer briefly. Do you find her 4 ideas, they find favor with you? Which ones, yes,
yes,
no?
Thank you. So NTIA, we are the federal regulator for government-held spectrum. We also represent the administration at the FCC proceedings. And the administration believes that you need low, mid, and high band in order to be most effective with the 5G deployment. The Mobile Now Act tasked NTIA to look at 3.1 to 3.5, and that is currently under review. We have a report due to Congress next year. As Deputy Assistant Secretary Strayer mentioned, there is a auction next June on CBRS, which is mid-band, and then there's one this December on high band. So we are hitting those important notes. Also mentioned supply chain, giving the Secretary of Commerce the emergency authorities to make determination against transactions that could be concerned with untrusted vendors in our network. So we are currently putting together the regulations on that as well. And we are all in agreement that software-defined networks and Open RAN is going to be a game changer for us.
All right, thanks. And just, do you agree with anything that she said?
I agree with everything she said.
Do you?
Supply chain security, a huge area of focus for CISA going forward, as well as securing the Internet of Things.
All right, thanks. All of us could tell you stories about how some of our students, our schools, our businesses are struggling in rural parts of our states. We could all tell you stories for lack of access to the Internet. And I would ask of you, Ms. Rosenworcel, if you would, having said that, what is the Commission, you talked about this a little bit already, but what is the Commission doing to ensure that Internet is accessible to all communities, and that 5G deployment is not another technological advancement that leaves the rural communities even further behind?
Yeah, thank you, Senator. Such an important question. We need to do more. We've got a digital divide in this country. It's real. We've got 12 million kids who can't even do their homework because they don't have Internet access. They're in every state.
Some of them are not complaining, but they need to be doing their homework.
We want them to be able to access the Internet and do their schoolwork. And it's just a window into this challenge we have. We got to fix it. I think we would start with better mapping. I know that Senator Peters has a bill just on this subject. Right now, FCC maps wildly overstate where broadband is and is not in this country. Go to every rural community. They'll tell you they don't have service. And yet, if you look at the FCC map, we found one subscriber in a census block, and we decided that it's available throughout. That's wrong. We're never going to know where to devote our scarce federal resources if we don't first get our maps right.
Yeah, let me just interrupt you. Aside from grants, what other support can government agencies provide to help advance Internet access?
I think that by refocusing now on mid-band spectrum, we could make a meaningful difference in the deployment of 5G. It propagates further and requires fewer towers. It's more economic to deploy in rural communities. And if we want rural America to see 5G, I think we have to focus on that sooner rather than later.
All right, thanks. Mr. Chairman, Albert Einstein's wife was once, he was married to a brilliant woman, but she was once asked if she understood her husband's theory of relativity. And she responded famously, she said, "I understand the words, but not the sentences." And I just want to say a hearing like this is helpful to me, and not just understanding the words, but some of the sentences too. So thank you all.
Senator Portman.
Well, Chairman, thank you for having this hearing. I apologize. I had another commitment earlier, so we didn't get to hear all the testimony, but we did have a chance to review it. And to me, this is ultimately about our competitiveness as a country. And we have kind of all the ingredients for a major problem here. One is the importance of 5G. The other is a China that I would say has become almost a techno-nationalist country where they use state power and often a disregard for international trade rules. This includes subsidies, but it also includes tech transfer. And often it's driving market-oriented companies out of business. And at the same time, we have a loss of production here of 5G hardware. And you talked a lot about the supply chain this afternoon or this morning, and I think that's part of the issue here. So in terms of being a driver for 21st century competitiveness, 5G just seems to me is very worrisome. By the way, we started an artificial intelligence caucus here in the Congress. We're trying to avoid getting sort of a decade behind on artificial intelligence, as in a sense what I think we have on 5G. So this hearing is really timely and really important. Commissioner, I was just listening to some of your responses, and by the way, I totally agree with you on the maps, and it concerns me because in rural Ohio, we have some areas that under the FCC map are said to have broadband capability, and they do not. Certainly not for the school children, but also not for a lot of our small businesses that are eager to be able to expand in some of our rural areas, but are being told, you know, it's going to be a long time and a big expense to get the ability to have fast internet, so they tend to go to the urban areas. Therefore, Columbus is expanding substantially, but not Southeast Ohio. On the issue of Chinese technology being at the center of the 5G future, I think we can't concede that. We have to figure out how to deal with that. There are some non-Chinese 5G hardware providers, I'm told, but there's no provider of that hardware in the United States. Is that correct?
That's correct.
What policies do you believe we should adopt to promote the reshoring of this production? And do you believe the United States can rely on some of these non-Chinese suppliers as an alternative?
Thank you for the question. First, I'm confident that we're going to figure a way to make sure that the United States succeeds. But here's some important data points. At the turn of the millennium, there were 13 big network equipment providers around the world. By the time the 4G revolution started, there were 7. Now we've got 3 or 4. And I think we have to be honest about the fact that we are allowing consolidation to take place among our largest wireless providers, and by doing that, we are reducing the number of providers that equipment manufacturers can sell to. It gets harder and harder to get into the business under those circumstances. That's a problem. So I think our way out is to instead focus on where we're best, which involves software. And so what we need to do now is what you've heard from some of my colleagues, and it's in my testimony, is we have to look at the radio access network and identify how we can introduce virtualization there. That would mean using off-the-shelf hardware, but its intelligence would come from U.S. sources and software. And I think that's where we need to focus our energies, and I'd like to see the FCC develop some test beds and policies to encourage that to happen.
Can that be done with the current consolidation, or are you saying that these supply chains are necessarily limited because of the fewer buyers, customers?
I think we've harmed ourselves with the current state of consolidation. It's hard to ask new entrants to get into a marketplace where there are a very small number of potential purchasers. But under these circumstances, I think what we have to do now is go to what we do best, and that's software.
Okay. Let me touch quickly on standards. This is a topic that may or may not have come up here today, but probably not, because it maybe seems a little esoteric, but I have raised this issue at the Belt and Road hearings we've had at the Foreign Relations Committee as well, because I think it relates directly to what on the international front. China has increased their membership in these international standard-setting bodies substantially. They take it very seriously. We don't. It doesn't mean that China is going to hijack all these international standard-setting bodies, but it does mean that our interests are not going to be well represented unless we begin to put more emphasis on it. So I don't know, maybe Secretary Strayer, since you used to work for this committee and also the Foreign Relations Committee, will focus on you on this one. In general, what do you believe the government can do to incentivize increased participation in international standard-setting bodies, and specifically, do you believe that by making it easier to grant visas for foreign individuals to come to this country, that we could have more of these standards conferences in the United States, because we don't typically have them here anymore. And can we incentivize more of these conferences to be happening here and get more U.S. involvement?
Yeah, thanks for that roughly two-part question. And I just want to break up the standards-making bodies between those that are dominated by governments that are multilateral, like the International Telecommunication Union, the big 5G conference that they're having to set or to harmonize worldwide spectrum policies occurring right now in Sharm el-Sheikh, Egypt. We have more than 120 U.S. government officials and private sector delegates represented there, representing us there. So we're taking a pretty aggressive posture in all of these standards-making bodies. I think I can let my colleagues talk a little bit about what they do, what the Commerce Department and others, how they're involved internationally in these standards-making bodies. But we are vigilant about what's going on there. We have noticed that the Chinese have come in larger forces there. We think there's been a pretty successful distribution of patents coming to U.S. companies and to Western companies generally. We work closely with our partners to ensure that we're having the right policy outcomes in all of those conferences. I think it's also important that we think about how we can encourage the private sector to participate fully in standards bodies. You know, standards companies participate in standards bodies because they see a value in them. You know, some companies just run to market with the latest technology. So there's got to be a real reason that they're participating in the standards body itself. And because it takes a lot of resources from their own internal research and development efforts to actually participate in these standards bodies, which can take years to bear fruit. So I think we can think about policies on that front.
Yeah. How about the conferences? My question was in part about these visas and the fact that we aren't having the conferences here in this country, and that puts us at a disadvantage.
So we are looking at hosting a broadband conference next year, and so I think we're analyzing that. You know, one of the issues is that we have national security reviews for people coming to our conferences, and you know, the world wants to participate in our conferences, including some countries that we have very substantial concerns with the activities of their governments and some of the officials in their governments.
So when was the last time we had a conference in the United States?
I know we had an ITU conference about 20 years ago.
About 20 years ago?
But that just one narrow sliver. But we have, you know, we host all kinds of meetings all the time here on a smaller delegation level. All of Western Hemisphere comes here to Washington for the pre-meetings for the larger global.
Do you think it'd be helpful to have some of the global conferences here on standard setting?
Yes, but I'm not sure that now that it's impeded by the visa issue.
It is impeded by the visa issues.
I don't know that it is. You're telling me this? I mean, well, we can look at.
We're told that it is, and also we've got our standard settings on the private sector side. We have an issue of American participation that we got to address. So I hope you'll be doing that in your role. Thank you, Mr. Chairman.
Thanks, Senator Portman. I want to go back to mid-band just to ask a question. Are there bureaucratic roadblocks preventing that? Are we just moving too slow on it?
Thank you, Senator. I think we are moving too slow. There's 16 other countries that have already brought mid-band spectrum to market. They're developing scale that we don't yet have. I think that, frankly, the administration made the easy choice, which was to focus on fairly unoccupied high-band airwaves first and push them to market through auction. But I think that's a strategic mistake.
I mean, the reason I'm asking, a couple months ago in the Commerce Committee hearing, we were, sensing a roadblock. I met with Chairman Pai on 24 gigahertz. I kind of raised the issue that the roadblock, is no longer there, which is good. So I'm just wondering, are there other roadblocks that people maybe aren't willing to testify to at the table today? But I'd encourage you to let me know so we can write letters, whatever, to get rid of those.
Our airwaves are a finite resource. We're not making more. And every one of us is using our device more often. We're using them all the time. We're demanding more from our airwaves. We're connecting more things. So the challenge comes in how you manage the incumbents that are in those airwaves today. They're often federal actors that NTIA oversees, and how you incentivize them to relocate and refine their operations so we can move commercial operations into the same hands.
So it's a difficult challenge. I just want to make sure there aren't equities or bureaucratic roadblocks preventing us to overcome those challenges, get moving on this, because it's top priority.
I think that part of the problem is our process is flawed. Right now, the commercial actors go and they tell us to start knocking on the doors of federal actors that have access to spectrum, and then we go back and forth, and it takes years. What we should do instead is we should build a structural incentive into their budgets for them to be efficient with the airwaves they have, so that when they relinquish them, they see gain and not just loss from reallocation.
Okay, so it's a difficult problem. Anybody else want to weigh in on this?
I'm happy to outline some of the work that NTIA has done over the past years on reallocating additional spectrum. Back in August of this year, I sent a letter to all of our spectrum federal partners asking them to assess their current needs and what could possibly be made available. We delivered a repurposing report that documented all the work that we've done. And NTIA has also worked with the Department of Defense on dynamic spectrum sharing.
No offense, I don't care to hear what you did. I'm trying to go, what's preventing you from moving faster? Again, I'm trying to figure out what's preventing us from moving faster when this is such a top priority.
No, go ahead, Hugh.
I just want to point out one thing that is a major impediment. That is, as you may be aware, the Sprint T-Mobile merger will expand the better use of their massive amount of mid-band spectrum. That's been approved by the federal government, but it's not been approved by the lawsuit brought by the state's attorney generals. So that's been slowing that process down.
So lawyers are one.
Yeah, and I would say, you know, if you look at mid-band spectrum there, that's going to cover, with mid-band, specifically by mid-band, they'll cover 3/4 of the U.S. population in 3 years pursuant to enforceable terms of that merger. So I think it's important that.
Okay, so I don't want to dwell on this, but I'm going to encourage, you know, after this to meet with me, meet with staff. If there are roadblocks, I want to know about them, so that we can utilize our oversight capacity to try and knock those things down. Because again, this is a top priority. Senator Romney was making an awful lot of, quite a few comments about how far behind we are. I thought it was interesting in the brief, a report by the Cellular Telecommunications Industry Association, basically in 2018 said that when looking at spectrum availability, licensing, and deployment of 5G, industry analysts concluded that China ranks highest in overall scoring for 5G readiness, with South Korea and the U.S. and Japan not far behind. In their April 2019 report, they said that U.S. has made progress and pulled even with China. So again, I don't want to I don't want to overstate if we're lagging. Again, we should be ahead, but is that an accurate assessment? I mean, should we be feeling a little bit better here, or is it as dire as basically Senator Romney was pointing out? And Mr. Krebs, you're moving there, so do you want to answer that?
You know, I want to go back to a number of the points that the panel's made, starting with Commissioner Rosenworcel on, and that I made about this is a blip. This is just a temporal anomaly almost. If we can unlock the open radio access network piece, the vendor base in the United States, the innovation base, is going to explode. And again, this is going to be a conversation we're going to think fondly back on.
So let me just, key. So you said if we can unlock, so what do we need to do to unlock that? What's the roadblock in us unlocking that?
So I think there are a series of incentives that need to be put in place to provide test beds, for example. Some of the work DOD is doing in experimentation on their basis, some of the work that I'm doing with my agency at Idaho National Labs. There's a whole bunch of testing and opportunity development, but that's just a small slice of it. There are others. Federal government
Does that have to be funded by the government? Is there no private sector incentive?
Some of it should be funded by the federal government, but others, again, the private sector is going to surge into the market if we can make it compelling. I think the standards piece, achieving true interoperability globally, is going to be critical. Not just interoperability in the sense that a Huawei technical stack works together, but it's that you can start putting bits and pieces of different vendors together. That's true interoperability. You do that, you already think about cloud globally. Microsoft, Amazon, Google, all these cloud service providers. We dominate the hyperscale cloud market in the world. Okay, what we're talking about here with virtualized networks and O-RAN is cloud. That's all it is. It's dumb metal with software writing on top. We own that space. Okay, let's make it a compelling economic incentive for us to get in there from a O-RAN perspective.
Okay, so what I'm asking, not at this setting, is break this down so it's understandable. If there are things that Congress can do, that this committee can do, either just targeted oversight letters to break down barriers, or a piece of legislation that will incentivize the private sector or provide funding to an agency to do this through government. I mean, we need to know that. I mean, this is, okay.
I got an idea.
Okay, good.
And by the way, I agree completely with everything that Chris just said at the end of the table. I think the FCC set up something called innovation zones during the last several months in New York City and Salt Lake City, where it will be issuing experimental licenses for 5G. We should see how we can use those zones to start creating test beds for more activity with open radio access networks. And we should comb through our rules to see how we can incentivize that and make it happen. And certainly with this committee's help, I hope my colleagues would agree.
Okay, and again, this is prodding coming from somebody who's not a real fan of government, okay? That, you know, really does believe in the private sector as being innovators. But again, we are in a competition with a command and control economy that is subsidizing and making it very difficult to compete. It's breaking down the marketplace. So we've got to recognize that reality. But again, we need to understand what we need to do in a very complex environment. So again, there's going to be a lot more work. You're going to have a homework assignment after this hearing. That's one of the benefits of coming before this committee. Do you have some more questions? Okay.
Thank you, Mr. Chairman. Commissioner Rosenthal, Warsaw, I just want to say I appreciate your passion on expanding broadband access everywhere. We've heard that today, and we've been meetings prior to this as well. You know, I've certainly seen firsthand in my state of Michigan that access to broadband is as critical as clean water and electricity. We have to look at it that way to make sure everybody in this country, no matter who they are, no matter where they live, have access to that. And remember that a lot of rural areas don't have 4G now. So to be talking about 5G, they're really very far behind. So I appreciate your comments on the mid-band as well as the mapping, and we've got to continue to work in that area. But my question to you is the FCC proposal would also bar communication companies from using support they receive from the Universal Service Fund to purchase equipment or services from companies that pose a security threat. So my question to you, why is this proposal only focused on service providers using USF funds when the FCC has jurisdiction over the entire wireless industry?
This is a good question. It is my understanding that based on the executive order, the Department of Commerce has an obligation to look at this issue more broadly across the economy. And so the FCC has focused on its distribution of $4.5 billion a year for rural America and making sure that those funds don't go towards insecure equipment. But I believe that under the executive order, the broader choices in the economy fall to the Department of Commerce, and they were supposed to have rules, I think, by this month.
Anybody else care to comment?
Yes, on May 15th of this year, the President issued an executive order giving the Secretary of Commerce emergency authority to make determinations against transactions into our ecosystem through information communications technology and services. It gave him immediate authority. He could act today if necessary, but we are currently working through the regulations, which lays out the process.
So there could be other funds that are being used besides just USF?
So there are no funds. This is just a procedural determination.
Okay, so right now just USF funds, though. There isn't. We're not looking at. And if this is a national security threat, why wouldn't there be other sources?
Well, I'm familiar with what the FCC is doing with
Right.
the Universal Service Funds, and I believe the broader obligations in the economy would fall to the Department of Commerce.
Are there proposals to prevent companies from using their own funding, non-federal dollars, from purchasing Huawei and ZTE, so they could be getting federal funds, but as a result of that, now they can use their private funds?
Again, I believe that that would fall to the Department of Commerce.
Any thoughts on that area?
Yes, again, we are currently moving through the drafting the regulations, laying out the process.
Okay, just one final thought. We know, and I think there's some discussion as to whether we're behind or we're in a blip or wherever we are related to 5G. But we know we were the leader in 4G. We were well ahead of everybody else. Now we're in a situation where we're debating whether we're behind or we're in a blip. We want to make sure the United States is a leader in emerging technologies on a regular basis, and we're at the verge of a massive explosion of emerging technologies that are coming on the market. Going forward, is there something we should be thinking about, that what we've learned from how we were leader in 4G, went to 5G, still trying to figure out how we get back ahead? Are there some lessons learned for emerging technologies generally that we should be thinking about right now as we approach this?
Senator, exactly. That's the bigger picture issue that a lot of us are wrestling with now. You might know that we actually have an executive order on artificial intelligence,
right.
basically our artificial intelligence strategy, and that composed of a couple elements. One is looking at how we advance R&D in in the domestic markets, as well as we build up a workforce that's going to be in that area. At the same time, protecting our critical technologies from other countries, such as China, from acquiring those and using them for their military through their process of military-civil fusion. So we need strategies on each of these, and we are developing. We have strategies on 5G and now strategy on AI, and I think that's how we have to address all these, and we have to do it with our partners around the world that share the same values that we do, because these are inherently discussions about how we're going to see data used by governments and by the private sector over a much longer term.
Well, I appreciate you bringing up AI. If you look at the investments that the Chinese are making in 5G, those are probably dwarfed compared to what they're doing in AI, and understand that that's one of the most transformative technologies coming forward. Mr. Krebs, I think.
So it's not just about our investments and where we're putting our areas of focus, but it's also about ensuring a level market or a level playing field globally, thinking about how do we keep technologies that have been derived from theft or other nefarious means, how do we keep them out of the marketplace? CrowdStrike a couple weeks ago released a report about a Chinese airliner that was cobbled together from 20 some odd stolen technologies from a number of different countries. You know, is it fair, is it equitable for that airframe to be in the global marketplace? These are the sorts of conversations I think we need to tease out further.
Right. Yes.
I would also like to mention our work with the American Broadband Initiative. NTIA has been co-leading, along with the Department of Agriculture, a plan on how we cut red tape on moving forward with the deployment. And you mentioned rural areas. Currently, the federal government owns 30% of land in the U.S. So how can we site? How can we build out fiber on federal lands? So these are some of the underlying, as you know, fiber will underpin 5G. So these are some of the important issues that will help promote the deployment of 5G as well as help rural areas.
Commissioner?
3 things. First, we have an 8-page executive order on artificial intelligence. We need a national plan and a national strategy. Other countries have them with clear goals. We do not. We've got to fix that. Next, we need smarter national spectrum strategy. A national strategy was due in April of this year. We still don't have one. And at the FCC, I think we're auctioning the wrong spectrum right now. And then third and finally, if Congress sees fit to ever pass an infrastructure bill, I think it would be important to incentivize municipalities to help with the streamlining of siting of terrestrial facilities required for next generation wireless networks.
Great. Thank you. Thanks to all of you.
Senator Hassan.
Well, thank you. And thanks for allowing a second round of questions. Thank you all for sticking with the hearing this morning. It's been a really helpful one. I do want to note that this committee passed a bill that Senator Warner and I had introduced on the Internet of Things security. It was a bipartisan vote, and it basically just said that if vendors want to sell IoT devices to the federal government, they have to meet certain cybersecurity standards, and it would be a very good way for us influencing the private sector's cybersecurity on those IoT devices. We passed it out of this committee. It hasn't been taken up for a vote on the Senate floor, and I think it would be a great thing for us to be able to do to help our commercial sector move forward in this way. I wanted to follow up a little bit with you, Mr. Krebs, on the issue of ransomware. So thank you for your willingness to work with local, county, and state partners on this. Obviously, ransomware has been impacting government entities across the country at all levels, including in my state of New Hampshire, where recently a county government was hit. Luckily, they had a backup plan. They recognized the threat. They shut down their systems, but they had to run a jail, a nursing home, and dispatch with pen and paper until they could get it back up, and everybody needs to obviously be prepared for that. And I understand that CISA has briefed state and local entities and has tried to share information with them about the nature of these threats, and that's certainly movement in the right direction, but I think we have to do more. So beyond briefings and advisories, what is your agency doing right now to get resources and expertise to those entities that have either suffered these attacks or are at risk of being targeted by ransomware attacks? And what help do you need from Congress to succeed in this?
Yes, ma'am. Thank you. So we have within CISA, we have a cadre of field professionals, whether cybersecurity or broader protective security advisors, that work day in, day out with state and local officials, sharing information, sharing best practices, reviewing response plans, reviewing architectures, trying to get them to a position where they can better defend their networks. With more of those field professionals, I can have more reach and more engagement. And we're not talking about a dozen here or there. I'm talking about, you know, a pretty significant uptick in folks out in the field. So that's something that we're working through right now. I also think that we have to get to a point where we accept the fact that we're never going to be able to completely defend our way out of this. You're never going to patch every system.
Right.
From a financial perspective, some folks just won't be able to keep up. They have, in fact, been left behind. So what is industry doing to help fill the gap? You know, how are companies shifting from a stockholder-centric approach to more of a stakeholder-centric approach and providing reasonable resources? And then last thing, I think we need to be thinking much more about what we can do to disrupt these actors. So it's bigger than, again, defending, but what is the role of other agencies within the federal government and the role they can play to stop these attacks before they actually happen and put the bad guys on the run?
Thank you. And then I wanted to come back to you, Commissioner, just to talk a little bit more about 5G. You know, you've heard it, and all of you have heard it from members of this committee, and I think probably an awful lot of members of Congress. We need to continue to turn to the needs of our rural communities when it comes to connectivity. As governor and now as senator, I drive all around my state, and I can tell you where we don't have access to broadband, to cell service, and I'm as frustrated by our mapping deficiencies as anybody else. We're all aware, too, to Senator Peters' point, that the benefits that 5G can bring. We've got to get 5G right for Americans who live in rural communities, not just in our largest cities. To that end, I have reintroduced the Bipartisan Airwaves Act with Senator Gardner, which directs the FCC to auction valuable mid-band spectrum, to your point, Commissioner, and then to use some of those auction proceeds to fund rural broadband deployment. Mid-band spectrum is crucial to developing a 5G architecture that works in rural areas, and making mid-band spectrum available will let companies innovate and develop new technologies that are suitable for rural deployment. As the world looks for leadership on 5G standards and technologies, the FCC has an important role to play in ensuring that America is the preeminent voice on what 5G will look like and whom it will serve. So, Commissioner, you have talked about this some, but I really would just like you to use this time to tell us anything you haven't said about how the FCC plans to use its existing authority to free up mid-band spectrum for 5G use, and how new technology can be used to drive down the costs of rural networks.
All right. Thank you for the question. Listen, there are a lot of places in this country that have no Gs.
Right.
And getting to 5G is going to be a long way. And the reason they frequently don't have that infrastructure is that it's costly to deploy, and there aren't a lot of people to spread the cost around.
Right.
And so the best way you can lower the cost is use the spectrum that propagates further. Right now, the FCC has focused all of its early energies on high-band airwaves, the 24 gigahertz band, the 28 gigahertz band, the 37 gigahertz band, the 39 gigahertz band, the 47 gigahertz band, that propagate roughly 300 feet. There is no math that is ever going to make that effective in rural New Hampshire. It could be interesting in discrete areas, but it won't be ubiquitous service, and it won't help the economy thrive, which is what you need.
Yeah.
So what we have to do now is reprioritize and start auctioning off mid-band spectrum. It's where the rest of the world is building 5G. We need to do it too. It's the spectrum that will get to everyone, everywhere, fastest and most economically.
Okay. Thank you very much, and thank you, Mr. Chair and Ranking Member Peters.
Senator Portman.
Thanks, and thanks for allowing a second round. So much here. One thing I'm told hasn't come up yet is looking at Einstein and how it's working. And Dr. Krebs, I'm going to pose this question to you. So Einstein is an effort to ensure that our federal agencies are protected from cyber attacks. We have Einstein 1, we have Einstein 2, we have Einstein 3.A, I guess, or 3A. And my understanding is that this current program, while effective in terms of these monitoring of the federal networks, does not scan the cloud. or traffic that comes in from mobile sources. Is that correct?
So Einstein 3A, in particular, DNS sinkholing and email filtering is architected to traditional on-premise environment with an Exchange server and things of that nature. As we shift to the cloud, and more agencies are shifting to the cloud, we're going to have to take a different approach. We're having a number of conversations both with the major cloud providers and email providers that work with the federal government on how we can get the transparency outcomes, the certain tags that we're looking for in email in particular, and we're having the progress we're making is noteworthy, but we are accelerating quickly into the cloud, and we're going to have to take a different approach. There's a recent policy, TIC 3.0 policy, and we're going to be sending out an additional security architecture baseline behind that in the next month or so, I think. But again, we are working through what some of the alternative architectures look like for cloud. I am very much interested and invested in this space, less about putting a physical device on a network and more about what do a few lines of code look like in the Azure marketplace, in the AWS marketplace, to get, again, the information that we need to ensure that government clouds are protected. And I would add that these are the sorts of capabilities, as we build them out and refine them for the federal government, we should also be thinking about how they scale to state and local governments with the appropriate privacy protections in place. We have similar capabilities under the Albert program for net flow and intrusion detection systems. How are these things also able to assist state and local capabilities as they also move to the cloud?
Well, you just raised a whole other issue, which is state and local government, which is a huge problem as well. But we're glad you're there. You have experience working in the private sector on companies that are very active in the cloud, and we want to be helpful. So let us know. As the chairman said earlier, if there are any impediments to that, because you're right, this is where so much of what we should be concerned about in terms of cyber attacks is moving, and yet Einstein, for all of its good work, 10 years ago, is not keeping up with the technological changes. So let us know how we can help you to accelerate that. On the state and local side, since you mentioned that, there is legislation that has been reported out of this committee. We're patting ourselves on the back a lot on this committee today because we've actually reported out some good stuff. But Senator Peters, you were the co-author of this legislation, and it basically says what you just said, which is we need to help state and local more. It's called the State and Local Cybersecurity Act. It would authorize you guys to work with some of these groups, including with the Multi-State Information Sharing and Analysis Center. And I know you're already doing this. This gives you the clear authorization to do it, to be able to help our state and local partners. And, I guess one question I would have for you is what opportunities exist to partner with some of these nonprofits to protect against the Chinese threats on the 5G space?
So that's a conversation we're having. Again, I mentioned the Denver event, the Rural Engagement Initiative, where we met with a number of rural providers and some of their trade associations on how we pull together kind of a best practice guide and playbook for how these rural organizations might be able to shift into a non-Huawei, non-ZTE environment. What we have to do is distill down some of the investments that the larger carriers have made, the successes, the best practices they've developed, and then we've got to push those down as far as possible, because you're just simply not going to find the ability to invest the way some of the larger carriers. So how do we, again, harness that investment? How do I distill down my own insights as a cybersecurity agency and then put into easy to apply playbooks and frameworks for these agencies to, or these carriers to do the things they need to do?
In that, and we think it's timely. One final question to Ms. Rinaldo, because you haven't gotten any questions in a while. We were talking earlier about your work on the expansion of broadband into rural areas, and you mentioned working with the U.S. Department of Agriculture. In the Farm Bill last time, we also had legislation that came out of this committee at some point maybe focused more on the rural communities, and the focus is to give them the ability through a new commission and so on to do more in terms of broadband. And we also have legislation to help the co-ops do more, called the Rural Act. because right now under our new tax law, there's some confusion as to whether co-ops might lose their tax-exempt status if they get involved in broadband. Can you tell us a little more about what you're doing, one with Department of Agriculture, and has the Farm Bill legislation helped, to your knowledge? And second, with regard to co-ops, are you working with rural co-ops at all on expansion of broadband?
Sure. So our current work with the American Broadband Initiative is we are helping coalesce more than 20 different departments and agencies on what we can do as a government to help break down barriers. And as I mentioned, 30% of federal land, 30% of lands are federally held. So as they're citing, can we build out fiber, we're also looking at how money's spent. We recently created a tool on our website where you can go for a one-stop shop to see where federal grants. I have not worked particularly with co-ops, but I'm happy to take that back, and I'll get you an answer, and I'll be happy to sit down with your staff and go over more of the work that we're doing in that area.
Well, if you could, that would be great.
Absolutely.
I mean, they're a natural partner in this, and they have the interest and ability, just as they've had with electricity. Now it's, it's broadband. So we would appreciate that. And thank you very much, Mr. Chairman.
Thank you.
Senator Portman, I was at an event earlier this morning on 5G, and there was a former mayor that is involved in one of these 5G test site cities, and he was talking about the resistance from the population of, putting up the antennas. Also mentioned that apparently there are Russian bots that are out there, putting out false information in terms of the health dangers of 5G. So I just want to ask you, first of all, is that true? And secondly, do we have in any of your agencies the research to refute that, and are you publicizing that?
So I'm generally aware of open source reporting that Russian disinformation campaigns are promulgating the concept that 5G is a dangerous technology. My agency is focused on raising public awareness of disinformation campaigns and misinformation campaigns, how they work, and the things that individually you can do as a consumer of media, social media, traditional media, or otherwise, of spotting these sorts of campaigns and not contributing and doing their work for them. This is going to be the battlefield, really, of the future. It's easy to invest, or it's low level of investment, broad coverage, and it's really hard to stop. So while the intelligence community and the Department of Defense are on the operational disruption side, we've got to do a lot more, I think, in terms of engaging the public on helping them understand how these things are happening, and kind of how the Russians are, and others increasingly, Iranians, Chinese, are trying to hack our brain to get us to.
It's really kind of a twofold counter. First of all, just point out the fact that Russia is engaged in this type of disinformation, but then we need to provide the accurate information. We need to have the research that, put the public's mind at ease on this. Do we have that research? Are we pushing that out either through the Department of Congress or through the FCC?
I'm not familiar with a particular white paper on this. I know through our broadband work that we are in the communities doing seminars, webinars with local communities to counteract any information that might be out there. So I'm happy to dig a little deeper and see if there's a report available.
Commissioner, do you know of any effort?
Well, I too have seen news reports like the ones you suggest, and the FCC does have an open proceeding on some of these issues. But I'd also say this, in the bigger picture, if we want to get the facilities deployed on the ground everywhere in this country, we're all going to have to figure out how to work with states and localities to do so. We have a 10th Amendment in this country. We treasure our local control. And we're going to have to figure out how we're all rowing in the same direction, and that's going to take some work.
Well, I think that particular state passed a preemption law so that all the communities can do it. So, again, but we also have to provide accurate information. We need to understand that this disinformation is out there, and we need to have a program for that. Commissioner, you talked about the FCC's seal of approval or whatever. Again, with the Internet of Things, you're going to have an explosion of devices. Do you have the capacity and capability of providing that type of approval for all these devices? Is there something in place, or can you envision something in place to do that?
That's a good question. It is so radical, the increase we're going to see in connected devices. By the end of the decade, we could have 20 billion things that are connected worldwide. I mean, for the FCC, This is a challenge because we're going to have so much more that's connected. But one thing I would point out is that we do have a process in place where the agency itself is not the only one certifying that these devices are safe and effective. We often do that through third-party certification bodies. And so what we're going to have to do, though, is identify new ways to stream this work. But I think we should also look at that process and see how we can build security into it from the get-go, so our authorization isn't strictly about interference, but also is about security.
So my suggestion would be the government help write standards through NIST or whatever, and then using underwriter laboratories
and
or
that is
those types of private sector.
Yeah, and that's historically how we've done a lot of these authorizations. If there is a totally new use of spectrum, the FCC will take a look at it if there are new devices with new capabilities. But once devices become routine, it typically shifts to a certification model done through third parties. And I think that that process could serve us, though it will be bigger in this environment.
Director Krebs, you talked earlier about the airplane cobbled together with all the stolen technology. One of the questions I have is just patents. Are we going to challenge, or is there an effort to challenge some of these? You say that China holds, what, 34% a pretty high percentage of the patents around 5G. I mean, are those valid patents? I mean, to what extent are those patents based on previously stolen intellectual technology, and is that one of the ways we can potentially combat them in terms of just not recognizing some of those patents?
So, extending out of my lane here for CISA, but I think this is a reasonable path. Do patents that are issued in China, do they matter on a global scale?
Anybody else want to weigh in? Mr. Strayer?
Yeah, Senator, I think we, not all patents are going to have the same impact over the long term of the ecosystem. And I think it's a little overstated about the success of China in this area. We've got a report out today that says that Intel and Qualcomm are leading in one of the patents that will be the most valuable for the 5G ecosystem. China has definitely played on a lot more teams that are fielding. So there'll be a consortium of companies that come together, and Huawei and others will put their people on that team just so they can take credit for that and tick that up in their count. So I just would recommend a little caution in some of the public debate about how you arbitrate where success lies in this. Okay. Our companies seem to be doing just fine overall, but as I said before, we need to be vigilant about how we participate and how we exercise control over the multilateral institutions that set up other frameworks that set the rules for participation and the later specifications that are developed under those.
No, I'm all about recognizing reality as it actually exists, which I think one of the things we're talking about the build-out, the 150,000 an antenna already deployed in China. In the end, that's really not that big a deal. I mean, these are pretty small little antennas. They don't cost that much. I mean, we're trying to build out these individual cities, really get the technology down right, know how to do it. China just may have wasted a lot of money putting up 150,000 antennas that just aren't going to really be all that useful. I mean, is that a relatively accurate statement, or? I mean, that in itself doesn't scare me. It's a scary number, but in actuality.
Sure, I think it's a useful data point. It tells us that they are ahead.
Oh yeah,
it tells us that South
aggressive.
Korea is ahead too when it comes to deployment. And one thing about technology is that deploying early and at scale gives you leadership opportunities. So I think we need to be mindful of it.
So, Senator, if I just weigh in on the point about us, we are leading on 5G. That is just it. Using the standard of how many towers you deploy in the field is not accurate. Just 2 months ago, China put in licenses for its operators to do 5G. So there's no way they could already be deploying 5G. They built towers for it, but they just gave out the licenses to the companies. We have it in more than 36 cities in the United States. We are leading in 5G. South Korea is right there with us. I'm not saying we shouldn't pay attention to competitors in the space, but a lot of this falls from the Chinese Communist Party and Huawei working so closely together to push out millions of dollars of propaganda through all kinds of means around the world. And I just want to let our legislators know.
China also leads in terms of producing these massive ghost cities.
Yep,
again, their system misallocates capital, but again, they can also be very strategic and they can subsidize and really hurt a free market competitive system as well. So, Ms. Ronaldo?
No, I would just echo that. It's population density. When it comes to patents, it's quality over quantity. Is my understanding that we're going to have more than 100 cities built out by the end of the year. So we are firing on all the points that we need to be.
Okay, magically, my time never even started, so I still got 7 minutes. Let me close this out, though, by kind of getting back to where I started. You know, the problem-solving process, gathering information, defining the problem, the opportunity of the problem, but then establishing achievable goals. So, again, what I wanted to come out of this hearing, the goal is, okay, what can this committee do? What can Congress do in terms of priorities that we need to set? You know, the goals we have to establish as you're continuing down your path. I mean, what can we do to help you? And, you know, can we kind of get some answers on that? Let's start with spectrum. And I'll go back to the homework assignment. I mean, if there's any roadblocks that we can help knock down, you know, either legislatively or just with oversight letters, kind of, you know, or shine a big old bright light on it to, okay, you guys, let's get this resolved and let's move forward. I mean, that's kind of what I want out of the closeout statement. So why don't you start with the Director Krebs? You know, what are those top 3 things, let's say? I mean, if you really got 5, go ahead. But I mean, what are the top 3 things you would like this committee, you'd like Congress to do in terms of achieving your priorities and your goals?
At the top of the list right now is make it easier for companies to share information on risky vendors that they come across, and make it similarly easy for me to share that information. I don't want to ever have to go through another Kaspersky Labs antivirus product situation. You know, we need to be able to rapidly get information out. Make it number 2 is make it easier for me to be able to convene groups to develop frameworks to share more broadly. And third,
why do you have a difficult time now? Just because antitrust, or?
There are some antitrust issues involved here. You know, I am restricted to some of the sector coordinating councils at this point in terms of those trusted convening mechanisms. So I think we can take a harder look at the way we pull groups together. And third and finally, we're working on an administrative subpoena proposal right now with your committee. That's a big priority for me. Once we identify vulnerable systems out there, whether it's, you know, in industrial control systems or telecommunication system, is we need to be able to get to the people that are managing those systems so that we can close down those vulnerabilities before a bad guy gets to them.
I'm quite sure that piece of legislation is on our markup next week. Hopefully
Good to hear.
Get that passed with strong bipartisan support, and then
Excellent.
We'll figure out some way to wind it through the congressional process, get that signed into law.
Thanks for your support.
Mr. Ronaldo.
I would say first, as you talk to business leaders around the country, encourage them to participate in standard body settings. Number 2, as you talk to your constituents, tell them about, you know, alleviate any concerns they might have about 5G. Talk to them about the benefits of it. And number 3, keep doing things like this. Keep having hearings. The underline of my 3 points is education. I believe education is the unsung hero in this debate.
Okay. Mr. Strayer.
Thank you for that question. One thing that we've been working on the State Department is creating the architecture internally so that we can be full competitors with China and Russia and others in emerging technology. So we proposed that there be a cybersecurity and emerging technologies bureau. That proposal has been sitting up here in Congress for the last 5 months under review in the Foreign Relations Committee. If you could help facilitate us
I don't
getting,
share.
Yeah, but you might know some of the other senators there. We would, when it engaged in a real dialogue about how we can set up an emerging technologies bureau that will make us able to fully work with our partners, our key like-minded partners on emerging technology issues in developing the strategies of the future, because we're not going to have all those solutions in the United States, so we really need to be equipped at the State Department to be able to engage in future discussions with our key partners. And part of that's resources in that, and part of it's the imprimatur that we are a major part of the department's effort in the future of digital technologies. And then the other thing I just want to mention was we really appreciate the financing that we get through foreign assistance money that can help us work with other governments on their deployment of trusted technologies in both 5G and future connected technologies. And lastly, just say that the way that I think you all have a united view about the threat and the risk from these types of vendors, and if you're enabled or in a position to share that in CODELs and other places with interlocutors and other governments and with legislators around the world, that it would be very helpful to us as we do our own messaging efforts in that regard.
You know, just a quick comment, you know, a year ago, as we're visiting all these delegations, nobody really understood Huawei. At least now they have the knowledge of it, and sounds like they're starting to take action on it as well. Maybe not fully as much as we want, but we've come quite a long ways from complete ignorance of the issue and the problem to not only acknowledgement of it and taking steps to alleviate it.
Completely agree. Thank you.
Commissioner.
Thank you. First, we need a national spectrum strategy, not just for this year or next, for the long haul, and it's going to have incentives for federal actors to relinquish airwaves for commercial purposes over time. The absence of those incentives slows us down. Second, we need broadband mapping. Senator Peters knows this. If we can't manage a problem, we don't measure it, and we are not measuring broadband in rural America right now, and I think it's going to have chilling effects for both national and economic security. Third, anything we can do to help with network virtualization and the Open RAN is something we should invest in. It's a way to help us manage these supply chain challenges going forward. And then fourth, finally, and this is just adjacent, but I think it's important, we do not have a national artificial intelligence strategy. Other nations do. We need one.
And what about quantum computing? Again, this hearing is so within this committee's mission statement. Our top priorities: border security, but then cybersecurity, protecting critical infrastructure, countering violent extremism, which often is more and more often doing online. So this is something we will continue to be fully engaged with. We want to be engaged. So again, I'm just asking all of you to work very cooperatively with not only members but our staffs, and we'll keep pushing the ball forward. And anytime you need any help from this committee or Congress, please, don't hesitate to ask, and we'll see we'll do whatever we can do. Got to get the magic words here. Thank you again for your time, your testimony. I thought this was an excellent hearing, and again, it's just a start. So the hearing record will remain open for 15 days until November 15th at 5 p.m. for the submission of statements and questions for the record. This hearing is adjourned.